Testing, testing. Testing. Hello. Couple more words. Can you hear me? I'm wearing a mask, so it might sound weird. Are you adjusting the volume? Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hello. This is the Encinitas Environmental Commission. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Can we have a roll call, please?
Commission Chair Novi,
Present.
Commissioner Morrison,
Present.
Commissioner O'Connor,
Here.
Commissioner Kramer,
Here.
and Commissioner Parker.
Here.
Let the record show we have 5 commissioners present, with Commissioner Switzler and Adams absent.
Thank you. Would anybody like to lead the Pledge of Allegiance today?
I'll do it.
Okay.
Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Do we have any changes to the agenda?
No changes to the agenda.
Thank you. And I just want to take a brief moment. I'd like to publicly apologize to Commissioner Kramer. A few meetings ago, I did not act, within the bounds of being maximally respectful to her and others, and I want to apologize for that and recommit myself to, not only acting fully within the full bounds of respect that we expect of this commission and any other public meeting, but of course to keeping the meetings within those bounds as well. So, Commissioner Kramer, again, I apologize to you, and I thank you for giving me another chance. Do we have any oral communications?
Yes, we have one speaker, Krista Orecchio. And the topic is banning glyphosate and other toxic herbicides, pesticides in favor of commensurate natural alternatives per Carlsbad. Did you want to speak? Yep, go ahead.
Good evening. So my name is Krista Orecchio, and I've been a resident of Encinitas for 22 years. I've also been a clinical and holistic nutritionist here in the city for 17 years, taking thousands of private clients through complicated health processes to improve their health. And I'm here tonight, I'm seeking your support, the support of the Commission, in the removal of glyphosate and other toxic herbicides, pesticides from our city, and asking this to be put on City Council's agenda in March. We recently met with Councilwoman Hines about this. We've partnered with the nonprofit Non-Toxic Neighborhoods to provide effective economic and viable alternatives that will still protect our native plants. And this has been successfully implemented in 200 neighborhoods around the United States, closest to home being Carlsbad and then also Irvine. The EPA released a biological evaluation that glyphosate is likely to injure or kill 93% of the plants and animals protected under the Endangered Species Act. There are no plants or animals or humans that can evade the toxic impact of glyphosate. It's banned in 21 countries and classified by the CDC as a probable carcinogen. Scientists have known for years it's linked to liver and kidney toxicity and cancer, and studies do show how ubiquitous glyphosate is in our environment and in our systems. I'm also the host of 3 TV shows. I have interviewed worldwide experts on this topic here on our local Fox affiliate and on my nationally syndicated show. And it is very clear that what we put on the earth goes in our bodies. Labs also prove that. As a clinician, I teach my clients to get off of glyphosate and GMO foods, yet I'm still running labs. I'm looking at their urine tests, and their urine tests are still coming back high in glyphosate. And that can be attributed to our environment. Encinitas residents worked hard to get glyphosate and neonics banned in 2015. And unfortunately, that ban was reversed on 9/11/2019 as it was a consent item at a city council meeting. I'm here tonight, and there's a group of us working together, and I'm concerned about the health of our city, about the health of our residents, and especially our children and our pets who are most vulnerable. And I also stand here as a mother of a young child. I go to all the parks all the time, and am taking my dog to all the parks all the time. And I think all of us want to see the city of Encinitas once again make health and safety of its residents and in its environment their priority by really becoming the gold standard of environmental stewardship. I am so proud to live here and work here, and I feel this place is a holistic model for the nation, and that our town deserves to be upheld and to remove carcinogens and known endocrine disruptors. Protection from these toxins should be a basic environmental right, and we are 100% prepared to be as supportive as possible in making this happen, and that includes protecting our native plants from invasive species, which is where it's primarily being used right now. And I feel that working together in this way will positively impact generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any additional oral communications?
No other oral communications.
Okay, we can move on to our presentation. Carol, do you want to introduce?
Sure. So tonight we're going to be hearing from Tony Gurno, and Tony worked at San Diego Botanic Garden for many years. He became the director of horticulture, and then on to the director of conservation, where he cultivated and he found and cultivated native plants. I know Tony more with the UFAC, the Urban Forest Advisory Committee, that he is now presently serving on. So, and also his work with San Diego Botanic Garden, where he was naturalizing, he was part of the group naturalizing the extension of Cottonwood Creek Park that goes up along the freeway. And because of that, the Arbor Day group, the Encinitas Arbor Day, was able to have Arbor Day in Cottonwood Creek Park and planted 50 native trees, mostly in that one area, making a native plant corridor. So thank you, Tony, for speaking with us tonight.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I did want to mention that on the agenda for tonight, it still references me at San Diego Botanic Garden, and as much as that's still going to be my home away from home in a lot of ways, I no longer work there, so we're just collaborators at this point. I'm grateful for this opportunity because basically, if anybody will give me time to talk about native plants, I'll take them up on it. I can talk at length all day about this subject, and I know that we don't all have that kind of time. So I want to make this relevant to all of you and the tasks that essentially are put before a commission like yourselves. So I'll get into it. Native plants in Encinitas. Let's see if I can actually do this with this. It doesn't seem to be working. So will you go to the next slide for me? Briefly, here's a little bit about me. I was actually born and raised in Encinitas, so I've been here 36 years now, and I have more than 10 years of professional experience doing all kinds of different things with native plants at some of the great, particularly nonprofit organizations around our area: San Diego Botanic Garden, California Native Plant Society, San Diego Zoo, the San Alejo Lagoon Conservancy, and on and on. And what I have had the opportunity to get engaged with related to native plants has just been extensive in breadth, and working all the way from private residential, land managers, quote unquote, to city, county, state, and even federal agencies Will you move on to the next one for me, please? Here's a little bit more about the background of Encinitas' plants. So I picked out a couple of my favorites of the extreme rare end of Encinitas' flora. This is the Delmar manzanita, a little seedling. It's an extremely rare site that I was happy to get to be part of at the San Diego Botanic Garden. And on the right is the endangered, it's actually federally listed as threatened, but state listed as endangered, Encinitas baccharis, named for Encinitas because that species on the right was originally discovered at the top of the hill, essentially adjacent to Encinitas Boulevard. More to the point, we have a little bit more than 1,100 different kinds of plants in our city, and just shy of 700 of those are native types of plants. And to give you a little bit of context as to how that stands up to other places, somewhere that's famed for diversity and being an incredible hotspot of plant rarity, Hawaii is a good example of that. They have about 1,400 different kinds of native plants across the archipelago. So Encinitas alone, being a little city, having 700, and 65 of those being in some form listed for having some kind of conservation concern status. It's pretty remarkable for a little community like ours, but you'll also see that there's been a lot of severe impact to native plants in Encinitas. The last thing I wanted to point out before moving off of this slide is just that the notion of different plant communities and how they're composed and the essentially kind of the makeup of the different groups of plants across our city is extremely complicated. And you can see all these different things: Diegan coastal sage scrub, southern maritime chaparral, Chamois chaparral, southern cottonwood, willow, riparian forest, which is kind of where Cottonwood Park fits into all of this. You don't need to know all of that, but what you should know is that the mosaic of native plants on our landscape is just hyper convoluted, and there are a lot of these kind of edge factors that you might know of from ecology, and there's a lot of interface of these different considerations within our small city. And here's what it looks like on a map. I think that this is part of what led to me being in front of all of you tonight, is that we were talking about this native plant ordinance as a multiple commissions and council kind of group. And the map on the left is something that I put together that shows all of the listed plant species in Encinitas. So those are the rare plants. And it's important to note that the more kind of broad, the big circles are less accurate. I guess I'll put it that way. And so you see all these little kind of mosaic hodgepodge of different shapes and polygons and points, and each of those represents a rare species of plant that's native to our city, somewhere in our city. And on the right, those are all of our native plants. And part of why I wanted to put these side by side is to show a couple of different things really clearly. First of all, do you notice huge gaps in both of these maps, essentially surrounding the Leucadia Piraeus kind of section, as well as from Santa Fe through the 5 corridor into Encinitas Boulevard kind of zone. There's been heavy impact from development in the coastal part of Encinitas. And one of the things that's important for all of you to know, look at the map on the right. Those are all of our native plants, not just the rare native plants. And look at how it relates to the map on the left. The point being that everywhere that there are intact native plant habitats in our city, there are rare plants there. And so it's simply put that anywhere that native plants have been allowed to remain in our city is also an incredible pocket of rare biodiversity. And that's not just plants, but also birds. So things like the federally endangered California gnatcatcher. Before moving on, I want to point out a couple of really important holdings, so to speak, within our city. You'll notice that the San Diego Botanic Garden there is covered in dots and points and all, because that's an incredible biological holding in our city. And similarly, low, I guess, to the left, at the very left edge, the west edge of Encinitas Boulevard there, that really dense area of points on the map on the right, that's the Cottonwood Creek watershed. And so this is a part of our city that's actually managed by the city and specifically for native ecology and quite effectively. So that's something that Carol mentioned. I also want you to look at the way that there's just this kind of big open mouth to the left C shape to the existing native plants in our city. And what you find is that the lagoons have been incredible, like places where early protections came in. And so those are amazing sinks of native ecology in a certain respect. And then the areas that were least favorable for development, which is particularly the interior bluff. So not so much the very westernmost bluff at the top of Encinitas Boulevard, but on the east of there, essentially above the Target shopping center, where Center for Natural Lands Management oversees a lot of that. You can see little bits and pieces of parks otherwise that are owned and managed by the city. But one of the things that you should note is that there aren't really that many places that are city managed that have a whole lot of native intact kind of diversity. And those areas where that's true tend to, by and large, be managed by nonprofit groups like San Diego Botanic Garden, Nature Collective, and others. So I wanted to touch on some of the different types of plant communities without getting into that really convoluted mix of all those specific plant types. So coastal sage scrub is by and large the dominant plant community in our city as well as San Diego, at least the coastal part of it. The chaparral and oak woodland mentioned here is actually something that makes San Diego as unique as it is. San Diego has more chaparral area than any other place in the whole world. And coastal sage scrub has been recognized as one of the most heavily impacted of any plant community in the entire country. So we have rarity across the board, and you get into the coastline and the salt marshes and the lagoons, and those kind of speak for themselves as far as their ecological significance and importance in ways like ecosystem services, for instance. Riparian canyons, I think, are probably the least appreciated of the zones of native plants in our city. And one really good example of that is the Ocean Knoll Canyon, this sort of open space area that's owned by the school district, but currently being restored by the San Diego Botanic Garden. So this is a dumbed down without being inaccurate way of looking at plant communities in our city. Coastal sage scrub is an amazing group of plants, and I wanted to just mention that this is the favored habitat for endangered bird, and the riparian zone that's true of a different species of endangered bird, but the plants in the coastal sage scrub plant community, by and large, are low-growing, really herbaceous and often aromatic, really oily, rich in volatile compounds. And this is where a lot of landscape utility comes from in our native plant palette. So when it comes to working toward ordinances that relate to managed landscapes, a lot of what that conversation relates to is use of plant species that come from the coastal sage scrub community. And that'll include things like, you can go to the next slide, sages, artemisia, which is sagebrush, California buckwheat. This is looking toward La Costa Glen. So this is a Center for Natural Lands Management overseen area. There used to be Encinitas baccharis in here. I haven't been able to find it. All I can find is giant thickets of poison oak instead. But this is an area that birds are constantly going to be flitting around if you're out here. It just grabs dew in this nice kind of coastal fog belt that we're part of. And one of my mentors in all of this told me that one of the ways that you can tell you're in coastal sage scrub, and I'll get into the chaparral as a contrast, but to start, oftentimes if you're walking through coastal sage scrub, you come out smelling as though you've put on some kind of high-end fragrance or something. So you can go to the next one. These are some of my favorite characters. White sage in the middle, just to get it, front and center. Everybody knows this plant in some way, and it's been a big cultural thing in our state recently because overexploitation of natural landscapes can be, characterized largely through a plant like white sage and smudging. So I am always an advocate for growing them. And if we can get more of these into more landscapes, then we don't really have to worry about them disappearing in general. The bladder pod on the left is one of the most bulletproof plants that grows in our area. This is the only thing that was tenacious enough to really stick it through all of the sort of upheaval on the Beacons Bluff. And on the right-hand side, that's a sand aster, just a gorgeous little low-growing thing that holds slopes together, grows in shifting sand, an incredible plant, and hugely underutilized in horticulture. I wanted to give you a taste not only of that first slide, which is the natural, intact coastal sage scrub community, but this is a restored coastal sage scrub habitat. And this is actually the far end, essentially just beyond the tennis court area within the Cottonwood Creek Park. And so this is adjacent to Highway 5 and some residences, and it was once solid ice plant, radish, and other heavy invasives. And you can see that one of the wonderful things about coastal sage scrub plant communities is that they're resilient, and they bounce back quite quickly, and that's not gonna be true of all of these. On the right-hand side is a case in point. It's known as deerweed. Unfortunately, a lot of native plants get weed in their common name. It's a bit of a pejorative thing that we're trying to overcome, but Acmaspon glabra is not particularly it doesn't roll off your tongue, but that's the name of this one on the right. Pioneer plant, nitrogen fixer. They grow basically with just enough water to get germinated, and they'll put seeds back into the environment. One of the most remarkable kind of reclaiming plant species in this whole group. Now we get into some of my most beloved plants, but they're also a lot more difficult to manage and to work with horticulturally. Chaparral is characterized by big, dense stands of plants that often have tough, kind of leathery leaves, persistent through the drought of summer rather than going into dormancy or disappearing back to seed or anything like that. Ceanothus, Arctostaphylos. If you see those two groups, so that's Ceanothus and Manzanita, you might know it better that way. If those are present in the landscape, you're probably in a chaparral plant community. And chamise is another one, Adenostoma fasciculatum. If you see that, I get excited about native plants if you couldn't tell. If you see those plants as prominent parts of the makeup of the landscape, it's undoubtedly chaparral. And within Encinitas, almost exclusively, we have a rare sort of subset of chaparral known as the southern maritime chaparral. And so Ceanothus here will be something like the coastal warty stem Ceanothus, rather than if you went out to, say, Lakeside and you get Ceanothus cyaneus, another rare, spectacular plant. Like I mentioned, San Diego is the home of chaparral. It's a Spanish word, but it's actually here. Chaparral is all throughout the lowlands of California. It's a very California iconic plant community, but San Diego is the mother lode of chaparral. And it's important for people to understand what it is and how it's different from grasslands or forests or other types of plant communities, because they each need to be managed differently. And here's an example. Any of you recognize where this one is? This is one of my favorite places in our city. It doesn't look like you're in the city. This is at the Manchester Preserve. And so this is an area that's managed by or overseen botanically, at least by the Center for Natural Lands Management. Most of what you're seeing on this slope, this is a Torrey sandstone formation, so it's the same substrate as what you'd get at Torrey Pines Preserve, but instead it's covered in Quercus dumosa here. This is an incredible, rare hotspot. Del Mar manzanita grows there as well. You have things like the rare Orcuts hazardia, which the only natural population in the entire country is in this preserve. But I find photographing chaparral difficult, and so I also wanted to include just some sort of pull-out images of some of the iconic plants that are in this community. So on the right, on the bottom, that's mission manzanita. Not a true manzanita in that it's not an Arctostaphylos. Xylococcus bicolor, incredibly difficult to grow. And so part of why that's important to know is that if there's a big old growth specimen, we cannot recreate that. And take it from me, I'm as good at doing that as anybody in our city. And when I look at something like an 80-year-old mission manzanita in the natural landscape, it's, you know, that's something that nature does much better than even the best of horticulturists out there. And on the top is flowers from chamois. It's in the rose family, quite pretty. That's actually the most common species of shrub in the state. So chamois is often targeted as part of these sort of fire-fueled, fear-filled conversations about California's native plants. So I want to put it into a prettier light for a change. Manzanita is kind of the king of California's chaparral. Actually, I'm working with the group to try to get the state to designate Arctostaphylos glauca as a state shrub, because we really aren't a very forested state, and shrubs are king in California, and I think that manzanita kind of takes the crown within that group. I wanted to show you this particular photo of me, not just because it's, you know, glorifying myself next to such a cool plant, but because often manzanita is going to be something that's head high, you're kind of like shimmying through a thicket, and instead our manzanita tends to be lower than your knee. Del Mar manzanita is incredibly rare. More than 95% of its original natural habitat has been developed or destroyed. The only way that these plants have a future is with assistance by, you know, people like all of us. And so this is a contrast, but otherwise, one of the ways that you'll know you're in a chaparral plant community is rather than coming out of it smelling like an after-dinner mint or something, you'll end up with holes in your clothes and scratched up and probably bleeding. Here's some more, just to show you that it's dense, it's stickery, it's difficult to hike through. John Muir referred to chaparral hiking as the most difficult hiking that he ever did. And I also just wanted to point out that, again, our city has a lot of very rare stuff. And so this is Quercus dumosa, the Nuttall scrub oak, and it's about to get state listing. So, you know, we have a lot of amazing little stuff, or a lot of amazing stuff, whether it's little or not, in those narrow ranges that still exist. The coasts are everybody's favorite part of our city, right? In order to grow there as a plant, you have to be tolerant of salt and a lot of shifting conditions, whether that be the bluff not being particularly stable or things actually growing in moving sand dunes. There's a lot of what's known as endemism, which means that a lot of these plant species that grow either along the coast or on the margins of the lagoons only grow there. And places like the Silver Strand in San Diego are some of the only other places in the world that you can find some of the plants that grow just along the highway in our city. And there's also that whole other, I'm plant biased, and I feel okay about that because there's so much animal bias otherwise out there in the world, but I do have to recognize as well that there are a slew of rare birds that use this habitat exclusively as their nesting region as well. Here it is. We got coastal woolly heads on the left, one of the rarest annuals that you'll find out here. We have some of my colleagues and collaborators out here in the coastal dunes near San Alejo Lagoon doing invasive species management for the most part. And one of the things I want you to notice about the plants here is they're very much unlike the big chaparral. These are all low-growing, a lot of prostrate plants. You can go on to the next slide. And speaking to that, this is known as the Nuttall's lotus, Acmaspon prostratus. This is a 1B listed species, which is the rarest of all of the native plants that are not extinct yet. And I hope that it stays yet. This is spectacularly beautiful. And if you're down there when these things are blooming, they're covered in pollinators. This is a riotous ecosystem. Even though it looks kind of sparse and it seems a little bit chaotic because it's not very static, you don't come back to the same plant in the same place necessarily very regularly, but that's what these plants are adapted to. This is the sun cups, beach sun cups, Camisoniopsis, and there's a few different species. This is Chiranthifolia, and I think it's the Subfruticosus subspecies, but it doesn't matter. There's a whole bunch of these little sunny, beautiful, they grow on the beach. And so this is some of the plant material that has been reincorporated into that Living Seashores project, which I hope that you're all familiar with in Cardiff. These plants speak directly to that resilience to climate change, tidal shifting, having some form of resilient coastal ecosystem is something that for a long time people just didn't recognize the importance of, and we're successfully playing quite a bit of catch up down there. Contrasting the purple to these are kind of reddish, but verbena, sand verbena with those sun cups, it's a perfect horticultural match made in heaven. And so anywhere that has significantly sandy soil like this, these are good candidates. And if you haven't seen these within the San Diego Botanic Garden, one of the places that you can find them is on the western edge of the California Garden where it's really sandy. It's kind of the bottom of a slope. And these plants, they just sort of shift around and do their own thing. And that's part of how they serve these ecosystems. There's Atriplex, ambrosias, others that are not as showy in their flowers, so I didn't include them just to, I want people to appreciate the beauty of native plants as well, because part of what we're trying to affect is use of them in landscapes, in private landscapes. And anyway, these plants don't successfully grow elsewhere. And most other plants would not successfully grow here. And so right plant in the right place is the foundational tenet in any kind of successful horticulture. And these are the plants that should be in this area, as well as along the new dunes on the other side of the highway. Lagoons and salt marsh and kind of the brackish aquatic plants, this is current, and they're just waking up. And so another thing that we all need to work toward affecting in our community and constituents is having some sense of understanding and appreciation for the unique seasonal shifts that we experience, which are different than in a lot of the other parts of the world, or in particularly our country. So in this photo on the left, you can see a lot of that reddish kind of browny stuff in the center basin is actually this Frankinia, a really neat, succulent, incredibly salt-tolerant plant. And it quickly goes into coastal sage scrub. And then in the background with the hill and the houses, you can see that gets into chaparral. And so part of why I wanted to include this photo is because it's not necessarily like beautiful in the kind of classic landscape sense currently, but also it shows just how complicated the interface of these different plant communities is. All right, riparian canyons are where all of the trash goes. This is where we often have remnant tire swings and different things, but they're critical. And one of the things that's different about Encinitas is we don't have that many of these. If you go down to the city of San Diego and look into the background of a group like the Canyonlands, there's all these little fingery canyons down there, and in parts of Carlsbad that's more true as well, and we don't have that many of these. And when I look at somewhere like the Cottonwood Creek watershed running adjacent to Encinitas Boulevard, it is a lot of our eggs, so to speak, of this plant community in a pretty small basket. And whatever we can do to foster and preserve the little bits and pieces of these areas that still remain and not allow this all to get just developed into oblivion is really going to be important, because this is probably the most straightforward of the upland plant communities in terms of their direct to us ecosystem service offerings. Things like water filtration and erosion mitigation and excluding highly flammable invasive species. So I want people to gain some appreciation for those thickets of willows and cottonwoods and things that you'll see around town. Here's some examples. That's actually the Ocean Knoll Canyon that San Diego Botanic Gardens staff is working on, and it doesn't look quite like that today because the arundo, horrible, noxious invasive species has been mostly, it's a work in progress because of not being able to use herbicides on this site, and it's incredibly resource intensive and difficult, but that's part of the effort there. Plant on the right-hand side is another one of these all-stars of native landscapes. Mule fat is the common name of it, Bacchus salicifolia. It's incredible. You can walk around and strike cuttings of these things and stick them in the ground and just keep walking, and that's amounts to successful planting. You can basically stick these like willows, but then they're a flowering plant that produces all of this nectar and pollen late in the season. So they're durable to drought, but they can actually grow with roots in standing water. These are the kind of plants that we need when we just need utilitarian plant material to, serve all of the different functions that an intact habitat like this does. On the left-hand side, arroyo willow, which is essentially the star of this plant community. And at this time of the year, they're starting to go dormant. And if you walk through the San Alejo Lagoon kind of nature center loop, which is where this photo is taken, at a certain time of the year, it's almost like it's snowing in there because of all of the catkins flying. And there are particular lepidopterans, moths and butterflies that use this really importantly as a host plant. On the right-hand side is a sycamore, which is known throughout not only California, but a lot of the West. And it's one of our few big trees, really. People talk a lot, and Carol and I work together on the UFAC, and people talk a lot about native trees. And to be honest, we don't have that extensive of a palette of native trees specifically from here. But where the conditions are suitable, which is generally where water sits, sycamore is a really important piece of our native landscape as well. And all of this, I want you to understand that not only do we have incredible sort of holdings in a certain respect when it comes to our native plants, our native communities beyond just plants, but that in Encinitas, if we don't work constantly to mitigate and better and work on behalf of these areas, they're gonna continue to suffer because the scales are very unfortunately weighted. And these are some of the clear and just standout threats to not only these native plants, but the broader habitats that they are part of. Development is an obvious one. I brought that up right away on the map slide. And any of you who've been here for any long period of time have seen areas that were once just sage scrub and canyons and little pieces of patchwork of old chaparral, old growth, and maybe some scrub oaks hanging on there get turned into shopping centers and housing developments, and we're all part of that. But it's important to recognize. And I put that at the top because I think it's historically the most detrimentally impactful thing that has affected the native plants in Encinitas, but it's not continuing to be that today. So climate change, came roaring up from behind, and there have been estimates that as many as 40% of our state's 6,500 species will disappear just because of climate change in the next, couple of decades. So there's that, and when it comes to things like the coastal habitats, that's particularly where this is poignant. But I really want you to understand how significant this last one is, because we only have these little slivers of remaining area that we've kind of allocated in a certain respect to native ecology and habitat, all these different things. And they're, in every case, circumscribed by development and otherwise impacted and changed landscapes. And so every one of the places in our city that has these incredible mini repositories of what has long been just one of the most stellar biodiverse places in the whole world, they're constantly under threat. And things like pampas grass, you got stuff like ice plants, but also just forbs, annual things that escape horticultural use. And so when it comes back to this notion of how to work more native plant material into managed landscapes, it can only be held kind of in tandem with the premise of reducing the constant battle against invasive species, both in and out of intact native habitats. Because the fact of the matter is that our native plants don't very effectively compete with things like black mustards, and you can see it. Go ahead. So I mentioned arundo. This is after it was cut down the first time. There was something like 100 cubic yards of biomass removed from this one little tiny patch. And there are others. This is actually rife throughout the riparian corridors in our city, incredibly difficult to deal with. And not only is this problematic because it outcompetes the willows and other things directly, but it also steals moisture and uses it, essentially acts as a giant straw. And so these plants transpire huge amounts, and they're essentially sucking up moisture that should be going to other native plants and habitats downstream. And on top of that, late in the season, they brown out and turn crispy, and they can be 20-foot tall, just pylons of ready tinder. So this is arguably the single kind of most villainous invasive species in our area, but it's not alone. On the left, I have a photo of me with not only the Phoenix canariensis, the Canariine date palm, but also pampas grass. And both of these, if there's water, they're gonna grow, if they can get there. And pampas grass, I did a report on this one in school, and the seeds can travel for more than a mile on the wind. And one plant can produce more than 1 million seeds in a season. So these things will take over in a moment if we allow them to, and we've positioned things so that our little bits and pieces of native habitat that remain are hugely under threat from these things. Black mustard, I mentioned. This is often regarded as quite seasonally beautiful, sadly. And so we have to educate, we have to really build up resource capacity, because there's no way that our wonderful little nonprofits like Nature Collective and San Diego Botanic Garden and other groups like the Cottonwood Creek Conservancy, that it's impossible with the current level of resources to anywhere near effectively even tread water when it comes to invasive species in our natural landscapes, and they are winning in some places. Ice plant, this is no longer there, so restoration does work, and it's wonderful when we can get that kind of support. This one, my friends at the Nature Collective took to referring to this one as the green carpet of death, because nothing native will grow back through it. Once it's there, that is an ice plant spot until somebody, good-natured citizens or whomever come in and do real work. It's hard work. And just to, characterize the radishes, we've got crown daisies, mustard. These are all introduced plants, intentionally introduced, not like they somehow got here and then escaped, but people specifically planted these. And they're taking over, and particularly where there are disturbances and people cause disturbances. And so the more that we as a community take advantage of the little pieces that we still have of our wonderful nature, the more that we also then have to mitigate our own kind of ongoing impact to these same spaces, because these are the edges of trails. And I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't have trails, but we should take care of the wonderful natural world that we've inherited here. Go ahead. So I already mentioned a bunch of this, but removing copious amounts of weeds, that's On the right-hand side, that's a trash cleanup from within the lagoon. I got to work with the county and San Alejo Lagoon Conservancy to actually kayak around through the lagoon, pulling out trash. This was before that big restoration. But this kind of stuff has to happen if we want to have the wonderful natural world around us that we've come to, really take for granted in some cases. So I just wanted to show you some positive stuff at the end of all of this. This is actually that Encinitas backers from the original plant slide, and they had not been seen at this site for more than 20 years. This is at the San Diego Botanic Garden. So this is something that I was really happy to get to work with Ari on, and we actually collected seeds and put them into seed banks, and this is a reintroduction site. So this is an endangered species native to our area that was actually discovered here that had since really started to disappear dramatically. And then we figured out, hey, we can grow these, and it's not too hard. And as long as there are people who care about plants like this, then we can keep doing work like this. And I think that we're gonna have to. Here's another restoration project that I'm working on currently. So converting things that were once riotous weedlands and invasive grasslands back into areas like scrub woodland and coastal sage scrub. And also, if you look at that first slide with the maps, most of what Encinitas is anymore is private or otherwise managed landscapes. And we need people to use native plants. And so here's some examples in the nursery. We need to grow more plants. We need to study our plants. We need to recognize what we have, make sure that it's clear what's where. Encinitas does not have a multiple habitat conservation plan, and that's one of the striking differences between us and Carlsbad, for instance, that relates very significantly to things like plan of attack for invasive species management. So we don't as a city currently know enough about our own plants, which is I guess why I got called in here, to effectively manage our natural landscapes. And this is what I hope that we're working toward in a certain way. And so if I can be of any further help, I will be happy to do it. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Tony, I had a quick question on, like, invasive plants. You're saying people brought them in for whatever reason. Are there some now that are prohibited? You can't get at Home Depot or various places that sell plants because of the nature of how they damage this particular area like Southern California? And if not, is that even allowable? Can you ban a certain type of plant that you know is invasive?
Yes and no, kind of. There are examples, but they tend to be very narrow and severe. And often the only way that kind of thing happens is if there's demonstrated agronomic or big economic impact. So if something is going to threaten nursery culture or production of avocados or whatever it may be, citrus, for instance, then there are some severe quarantines that are in place, but a lot of it comes down to resources again. But the other side to that coin is, the consumer demand kind of pressures, and places like Home Depot won't sell invasive plants unless people are going to buy them. But they do.
I have a question. Thanks so much, Tony. That was such an awesome presentation. And your enthusiasm comes through for natives. I kind of work like, I study coral reefs, and I studied the phenomenon of shifting baselines, how we just kind of forget what was natural around us, and we come to expect less from the natural world than we should, because what we see as natural is actually already a very degraded system. And so just thinking about Encinitas, our city's named for little oaks. So what are those little oaks? Which species is that? And would it be kind of like a helpful action to name that our city's tree and kind of promote what was natural in Encinitas? And have you already thought about things like that?
I like all of that as premise. There would be two different species of scrub oaks in our area, or little oaks, and one of them is super rare and endangered, only grows in kind of the coastal bluff zone from Santa Barbara down here. And the other is a little bit more ubiquitous throughout kind of the coastal foothills zone. Still, plants don't have to be rare for them to be something that we hail in terms of heritage and, community values and all of that. And part of the struggle with our native plants, simple as it sounds, maybe dumb as it sounds, is that some people will look at those and not see tree. And so just having something that's kind of a big shrub be recognized at the same kind of level of prestige as trees. Many of them are older than our biggest trees. So I like the idea, but I think that we need to do some, I don't know, like focus group work or something. But the city has actually been doing really good work when it comes to scrub oaks recently. And so some of them were put into the Cottonwood Creek Restoration Site, and I'm still working with the city to forcibly, bug people about getting more interesting native plants into city-managed landscapes. And so we do have other rare oaks from the area that are also going in here. So Encinitas, as far as oaks go, has really stepped up in the way that the city is serving those plants, which I'm happy to be able to report.
Great, thank you.
I have a question. You're obviously the expert, an expert on native plants in this area. And so, we've been talking about a native plant policy for the city. And I kind of like your opinion on how best to approach a native plant policy in terms of what is mandated or what is suggested, or I'm not really sure how best to approach a native plant policy.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It seems very complicated to me, and I've been involved with the county's process as well as with our city, and I much favor the tact that our city is taking because it's a lot more clear and straightforward, and I think that those are important components of this. I tried as hard as I could to just barely scratch the surface, and it already gets complicated. And the horticultural maintenance is complicated, the sourcing of plants is complicated. People have gone to universities to study design that didn't include any of this stuff in plant palettes in some cases. I don't mean to speak badly about landscape architects too generally, but there's a lot of different moving pieces to this. I don't think that it makes any sense actually to just say we need X percentage of plants going into various forms of landscapes to be native. I don't think that that actually effectively meets the effect goals. Like, we have to be clear about what we're trying to have be different. And if that's just more quantity of native plants in the landscape, then just mandate that new design and city landscapes have some percentage of native plant material. But if we're trying to affect things that I think are more consequential, but also deeper and more nuanced, efforts like establishing better connectivity of our different pieces of intact native habitat, it's trickier because you have to then talk about plants within our native palette that should most appropriately go into a given zone. And so I have to, based on my personal experience with all of this, step back quite a bit from this whole tendency toward hyper-localism. And I actually was a strong advocate for just adopting the San Diego Plant Atlas list as what is quote-unquote native, because it is clear and it's an expert resource that we don't have to continuously update. And with that said, we're already sort of fudging some of those goal parameters. Putting something from East County in here, I think, is a good thing in many cases, but I don't know that that's the best way to serve, our a particular niche of native ecology. So I think that actually Ari was the one who brought this up in the first meeting, that we need to be clear about what we're trying to have be the outcome of these things. And if it's, my favorite part of all of that is getting people who garden to use more native plants. I think that that's the most fun part to be involved with, and education is really, really important and fairly lacking, actually. And I don't mean education in terms of the ecology kind of context of our native plants, but how to use them in a garden. Like when do you prune this thing? And does it ever need fertilizer? And these kinds of considerations, there really aren't that many, there's not that much sort of overall holdings of expertise generally. And so training of landscape maintenance professionals, I think, is an important part of this. Somehow having a pipeline connection of native plant materials from nurseries, and you get outside of Encinitas very quickly. So I think that in a lot of ways, what I'm seeing is parallel to what we're dealing with the urban wood recycling premise, that Encinitas is a very small place, and we don't have that much square footage of land to do much of anything. And so very quickly we get outside of our city proper. And I think that if we're going to be successful with this whole thing, that kind of just working with that admission is probably an important fundamental part of that.
I'm going to hit you with a whole bunch of stuff. That's the point as the landscape architect here in the room. Arundo is my least favorite invasive, so thank you for putting it on there. One that I would hope you could put on there for me is the castor bean, because while that is invasive and actually deadly, it is beautiful. People
true.
look at it and think it's beautiful, and I walk by one with a nice 18-inch leaf every day, and it's purple. So if that could go on the slideshow, that would make this landscape architect happy.
I'll take that note.
The planning commission requires all your 50% of your plant material currently to be native, which yes, as somebody who did design in the city, I did use the Nuttall oak as my screening, even though I know it's going to grow slow, but it still meets my tree points and it's native. So we'll see if the city catches me on that one. As a landscape architect, I do tend to try to use natives as much as possible. A lot of times it's mandated, and just for the lay folks, you two can tell me I'm right or wrong or whatnot. But Tree of Life Nursery, just the website itself, is an awesome resource. They have PDFs you can download. Just the plant catalog itself that you can download has so much scientific and climate information. They have a bunch of PDFs on there as well for creating certain zones and replacing your garden. I mean, just I design from there because I design from what's available commercially, and that's where I go to. Because it's a greater chance of success. But just using that as a resource, I'm not pitching for Tree of Life or Musa or Las Politas or anything, but Tree of Life has the greatest. I print that thing out every 6 months. So thank you very much for your efforts.
It's my pleasure.
I had one last quick question. So the city's not making a formal push for a tree canopy goal or percentage, but you're talking about knee-high and shrubs and bushes. Is there something native that fits that bill over so much time it becomes a tree that's recognized to be part of a canopy?
This is, I like that this conversation is becoming as horticultural as it is, because those are the kinds of things that I don't wake up worried about them, but I muse about these very things constantly. And one of the things that our city has been doing lately is putting in Quercus engelmannii, the Engelmann oak, which is not native right here. It's native like Santa Isabel area, and they're endangered. They're starting to disappear from their natural range. They're not really reproducing anymore, and they do what you're describing. They're a upright, single-trunked, really stately, gorgeous tree in time, and we had almost none of them. The Botanic Garden had one, and the Leech Tag Foundation next door has two. It was almost non-existent in our city, and now there are, I think, have been 7 that have been put in with the last year, and they're pretty hard to find. And so To your point, some of our native plants are difficult to use in very humanized kind of utilitarian, arrangements. So Chris Kalstrand and the UFAC, everybody working with the tree stuff with the city, would love to see more oaks generally. Just live oaks are famous. That's part of what makes California, California. But if you put one of those, which is still happening, into a narrow median, it's gonna take that tree 150 years to be over traffic. And there's things you can do to train them and pick lowest permanent branches and really foster this stuff through arboricultural techniques, but you can't make a plant what it's not. And so something like Quercus dumosa is, it's not going to hit tree marks on something like the canopy LiDAR surveys. They're going to be considered shrubs. And I don't know that it's semantics in a certain respect, but it's important that any of the conversations that revolve around our native plants recognize that there aren't that many trees that are native right here, and we should, embrace what we do have. Thank you all.
Dumbosa is still a tree, and it counts on my planting plan.
I'll support you on that. I can actually take people to Quercus dumosas that you can walk underneath the canopy. It does happen.
So, Tony, can I just ask you, you were saying something that Carlsbad had that we didn't have? Could you just repeat that?
Yeah, there's an arrangement system known as a multiple habitat conservation plan or multiple species conservation plan. And there was this big effort through SANDAG and in coordination with the USGS and some big players to bring in as many of the municipalities into a county-wide approach to managing San Diego's rare plants. So there's a program called the Regional Rare Plant Monitoring and Management Program. It's not that easy to say, but it's a really important thing. And there's quite a bit of money in that through SANDAG and other funding sources to do things like surveys, study, outplanting, reinforcement, restoration. And Encinitas got to the point, I forget the details on the timing of this, but all of this was being worked out, and there was essentially a draft plan for Encinitas as part of that whole big effort, but it was not ratified. We didn't sign on to it. We didn't approve, incorporate that
the
plan.
90s.
Okay.
Yeah. And
So it still
Tony-
sits there.
Yeah, it's there. And Tony and others in the discussion around the native plant policy have, inputted into that process that maybe one of the most important things the city could do would be to finalize and sign on to an MSCP. So I think those of us who are involved in that process really should, make sure Tony stays involved as well, but that is a really, really key component. And Carlsbad has served them well, as have many other municipalities, and the counties, as for the unincorporated parts of the county, is very good too.
One of the big things that's a positive after effect to having something like that in place is that you can get money from state board of, wildlife board, Section 6 funding from the endangered species program, those kinds of things. We don't currently have a plan, so to speak. And so it was basically whatever the group of, heartfelt nonprofit professionals were willing to put together that has been what Encinitas's plan has been de facto so far. So it would be really wonderful if the city would make that a whole thing.
So, Crystal, can you talk to that?
In terms of what the city's doing to adopt a multiple species, I can't actually. It would have to be direction from council to do so. And I don't think that has been done. But if it's something that, is of interest to the commission to, move forward as a potential initiative to propose to council, then they could, direct staff to be working on something like that.
Commissioner Parker, we talked about it. during the native plant policy kind of working group. And I know that Councilmember Lines, she was interested in it. We kind of proposed that that be the basis for prioritizing areas for like native plant or native habitat restoration in terms of plants. And so I think there is some interest. So if you would like to work on that together, maybe we can try to think of ways of kind of bringing that forth through the council and bring it to the attention of the city council. But yeah, I think it's important.
I think we've spent a lot of time. I could spend more and more time on this. I've been quiet because I've been very fortunate ever since I moved to Encinitas. Tony's been kind of my plant Sherpa, and I miss not working with him at the garden anymore. And I think I'll just say, I think Encinitas and then the whole county really, and even Southern California and beyond, are just really fortunate to have Tony and his gifts. And thank you for all of your service. And Tony left the garden a couple of months ago to start his own business, and he'll be a big success. And he already is. And it's also really generous and kind of you to continue to serve the community in the way that you are. And we're all just better for it. So, thank you. And I know this won't be the last that we all get to hear from you. And in particular, I think that the process happening, in the joint process between this committee and the Urban Forestry Advisory Committee that Tony is a part of, working on the native plant process, which hopefully will be a very inclusive process. I think the other thing we haven't talked about here that will end up in that process is the state's 30 by 30 mandate, and that's an exciting area as well, which promises potentially funding and land acquisition and all kinds of really cool things that could help us with plant restoration, conservation, and all the other things. So Tony, thank you, and I'm sure we'll be hearing from you more. Okay, let's see how fast we can get through this part of the agenda. Okay, can we get
Sorry, can I interrupt for just a second? I think we just need to let the record show that one of the commissioners had to step out. So Commissioner Morrison is no longer at the meeting.
But we still have a quorum, so we can still move forward.
Yes, correct.
Thank you. Okay, so we will entertain a motion to approve the minutes from the November 10 meeting.
I'll make the motion to approve the minutes.
Anybody want a second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Minutes approved. That's okay. I got it here. We're on number 7, tentative presentation schedule. Take it away, Crystal.
Sorry about that. Okay, so this is the tentative presentation schedule that you have currently in your agenda. We just heard from Tony Gunrow regarding native plants tonight. And then in January, we'll be hearing from Commissioner Adams, Commission Vice Chair Adams, and he'll be giving a solar presentation. And then in February, we have proposed to hear from the Surfrider Foundation regarding the Oceanside Groin Project. And then at this time, if there's any other suggestions for future, we do have 3 months booked out, but if there's any other ideas, now's the time to discuss.
This would not be the time to request presentations or informational items by city staff, right? That's separate type
Yeah,
of
that's a
presentation?
little different. I'd probably do
Okay.
that at the end,
Okay.
and then, yeah, we can.
Thank you.
Any further conversation or discussion on this topic? Nope. Okay, thanks, Crystal. So now we're moving into action items. So we have 8A, Commission Work Plan. Crystal again.
Thank you, Commissioner Chair Novi. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong item. So this is your current work plan. I'll just note that the work plan that you approved at the last meeting, your updated work plan, that still needs to go to council for adoption. So that is scheduled to go to council on December 21st. So as soon as that happens, then this regular meeting item will reflect that updated plan. But for now, we're still working off the current plan from fiscal year 21-22. And not a ton to update this month. I'll scroll through here just quickly. Yeah, just at the very bottom regarding item 14 on plastic pollution. I'll just mention that we are scheduled to have a public workshop on the smoking ban on Tuesday, December 20th, and that'll be from 6 to 7 p.m. at City Hall in the poinsettia room. And work has been going on to develop the draft, and there should be a draft for public review by that date.
I was going to ask on the overall one for next year. A few commissioners were absent at the last meeting, and I know we put a few people on hoping that we put you into the right spots, and then it kind of morphed into, we'll let you decide yourselves. So if there's anywhere you see there's lacking a third commissioner, or we also mentioned if we jumped into something you're so passionate about, one of us would maybe back out and let someone else take a lead in any of those categories of the new upcoming ones. I don't know when a good time for that is.
Yeah,
to be
I'd
done.
say once we are, it's been adopted by council, and then when we start seeing it on these regular updates, we can make those amendments.
Okay.
Question, do the memberships here for the subcommittees reflect the changes that were made last month? No. Okay, so we won't see that until council.
No, they'll be on the agenda for the 21st.
I see.
I can,
Okay.
or it was part of the action for last meeting, so I can send you the draft
Thank you.
version so you can, yeah.
That'd be great, thanks.
Okay, so I think we need a motion to approve the work plan here, fully understanding it will become obsolete rather quickly, and we'll start seeing the new version probably at our next meeting. I'm happy to make that motion. Anybody want a second?
I'll second.
Okay, any more discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you so much. That's approved. And I wasn't here last month, but thanks to everybody who worked on the new work plan. I thought it was outstanding. I love that we're doing a 2-year work plan. That was a brilliant idea, whoever's idea that was. And great work.
Oh, and just one thing to mention since we're on the topic of the work plan, sorry, I should have mentioned this. There was a discussion of the Bee City USA discussion that council had a couple months ago, and that it sounds like that may be direction from council to add that to your work plan. So that might be something new that you'll see that council adds to the work plan.
Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, we have no commissioner-initiated action agenda items. And so now we have time for some updates on items of interest from anybody. Do we have any? Okay, does anybody have any future commissioner-initiated agenda items?
I do. It was brought up last time quickly, plastic was going to fall off the work plan, but it's been put back in. One of the reasons is when Encinitas passed its single-use plastic ordinances, it was kind of state-of-the-art at the time, and now with technology and changes in products, other cities have rewritten the language to be more inclusive of the better products. So I have the draft of Carlsbad just did one that's much more state-of-the-art, and mostly it was the definition of compostable. And so I'd like to bring that forward at the future to discuss the language that's included in that and potentially revisiting the Encinitas' single-use plastic ordinance to amend it to include the verbiage of compostable, and then wherever it needed to be in the ordinance itself to reflect that language of what is considered compostable. And again, working with EDCO and the digester and all that. So there's some work to be done, but I would like to get it out there for a future discussion.
Fine with me.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Sounds good to me. I'm on board.
Okay, well,
I have a couple things.
Oh, yeah, please.
If we're still moving on. I would like to throw out the idea of having a presentation from city staff, just giving a little bit of background on the city's integrated pest management plan and just the evolution of the kind of updates that were made in 2019, since those were done before any of us were here on the commission, or not any of us, but several of us. Yeah, and so just to get a little more background on the issue would be helpful.
Yeah, I can ask Parks to provide a presentation.
Thank you so much. And then I had one other kind of a unrelated item that is I'm interested in bringing forth in the future. San Diego just updated their climate action plan, and like Mark, you're saying, it's a little more state of the art as the state of science is progressing with regards to climate impacts. It actually includes meat reduction efforts, because the production of meat contributes greatly to greenhouse gas emissions. And so I'd like to just investigate avenues for incorporating that into our city's climate action plan. We don't currently.
It's perfect timing that you bring that up because we're about to embark on our CAPT update as well. I have the staff level kickoff meeting with the consultant in January, and then there will be a series of points in time where I'll bring drafts and items to the commission so you can weigh in on how to update it, revise it, add to it, and that would be the perfect opportunity.
Great. Thanks, Crystal.
Anybody else? Okay, well, then we can adjourn. Thank you all. Next meeting is January 12th. Happy New Year.